For those that are joining right now, this is the Alumni Series, I guess, for the Media Art Data and Design Center. I will let Patrick take it away with introducing our panelists for this week. Two amazing people that I'm super excited to have join, especially because they come from the same year that I graduated, which is kind of weird. Time flies. But yeah, Patrick?
Excellent. If you're watching this in the video format, you missed a great conversation about what we're all playing. You'll never know. So sorry about that. Some things need to remain outside of recording. I'm going to introduce just Rachel, and it's just going to be a little bit embarrassing because we've been doing this thing where we go back to like what you were doing when you were an undergraduate. I think it's like beyond being embarrassing. I think it's very important, given that like you are giving all of these wonderful things back to us, and it's really great for students to know some of what you were doing. I mean, I don't know the cool stuff that you were doing really here, but I can report on the things that I saw. So Rachel graduated in 2014 with her bachelor's degree in computer science. I suspect that if we had had a media arts and design major or minor, she might have been lured into a double major or minor, but I think it's maybe even more impressive that she ended up where she is today without that kind of formal curriculum. I worked with Rachel in the first course that I ever taught about alternate reality games and transmedia design in fall of 2012. And this was a course that was co-taught with Shashin Wei via the Gray Center for Arts and Inquiry. And during that time, Rachel wrote a midterm paper on the failed alternate reality game Tomorrow Calling and its quest-based failures and what that did to the immersion of the game. So it was theorizing immersion. And the paper also touched on Superstruct and other ARGs. For her final project, Rachel worked with a 4-person team to create a game design document for an alternate reality game entitled Daybreak, which took place inside the Regenstein Library and sought to defamiliarize that space. And notably, I just want to add as a historical note, I was writing like a great history of the great game designers of the University of Chicago, I'd have to say Rachel was in a team with Keith Wilson, who now still does game narrative work for one of our game labs here at the university. Another intersection that I had with Rachel was when she worked as a mentor for our first ever alternate reality game that our Game Changer Chicago Design Lab ran for 140 high school students, mostly youth of color on the south side of Chicago. And Rachel was an outstanding mentor for her team who had not only game skills, but also social and collaborative skills. And she did amazingly because we were basically building a plane we tried to build a plane while flying it. Yes. And Rachel just like went with that. We did not know how to design ARGs back then. We kind of do now. An additional sign of Rachel's excellent leadership was that at the end of 5 weeks, her team came out #1 on the leaderboard out of 13 competing teams, which I still remember. So excellent work, Rachel, as an instructor. Anyway, so that was just my jokey thing, but currently Rachel works as a creator, educator, and advocate for games as an art form. At her day job, she works as a gameplay engineer at Bonfire Studios, a small independent game studio. On the side, Rachel also teaches a class on creative coding at the University of Pennsylvania. Rachel loves play and strange interdisciplinary problems that blend art, tech, and design. We're very lucky to have her as an alum and to have her back for this event. So thanks for joining us, Rachel.
I'm blushing. Thank you, Patrick.
And then I'm nowhere near as elegant as Patrick is with his words, but I will now get to embarrass Gamal, who's a dear friend. So Gamal graduated in 2016 with a computer science and linguistics background at the University of Chicago. And back when we were students together, we had long nights at actually Currar in the Cecil libraries, right? When we were taking classes together, like intro to computer graphics, listening to scene music very loudly while doing that, and creating things like programming things from scratch for visuals. And I remember Gamal's final project quite vividly. He produced a weather simulation, if I remember right, from scratch in John Reppy's GLSL programming languages and OpenGL, which if anyone has taken that course, it is kind of a mess for different reasons. It definitely drowns you, and it's a trial by fire. And I'm glad that through that trial by fire, it seems like Gamal has made it out alive and is doing quite amazingly. So On the more concrete, oh, and we had D&D together also. I haven't forgotten those days. Those are like so old. It's like 10 years ago at this point. We're like ancient people. We're rising out of the tombstones and the graves or something at this point to talk to people. Now, for the more serious side, Gamal works as a full stack developer, worked on full stack development at Microsoft for 3 years before starting a language learning company. He served as a language learning company's technical lead, UI UX designer, and developer for mobile applications. After sunsetting that company, he joined Electronic Arts as a tool/infrastructure developer for a Star Wars title and an upcoming release from another franchise. His day-to-day involves working with Unity and AWS and developing standalone tools for game developers and quality assurance. Outside of work, he maintains a schedule for language learning, single-player RPG and MMOs, and figure skating. I've definitely heard a lot of messages about figure skating before. And while Gamal has worked a lot since graduating, his most cherished work was a multiplayer pirate ship simulator developed in his senior year of college. So give it up for Gamal and Rachel. I will now be passing the torch to Ash.
All right, hello everyone. My name is Ash. I am the Assistant Director of the Weston Game Lab, which I am currently in, and I will be moderating this amazing panel. So thank you all so much for the introductions for Rachel and Gamal, and I'm excited to ask you a few questions. Now, before we get started on that, for those of you who are watching at home, feel free to type your questions in the chat because this will be kind of a casual, informal conversation. And so if there are any questions that you all have, please drop them in the chat. Jazz is going to help me organize them and make sure I do not lose them. And so I'm going to be asking those questions when it makes a lot of sense in the conversation. So they're not going to necessarily be linear, but again, we're going to have a great conversation. Oh, okay, very good. But before we get started on these kind of like larger kind of specific questions, I wanted to actually, we'll start with you, Rachel, as Gamal fixes up their setup. But I would really like to just get a sense of what is it that you do on the day-to-day? What was your pathway to get the job that you have to really kind of help ground our students who are here and thinking about getting into the games industry? So could you just kind of give us a little bit of a background about like, how did you get here? What did you do?
Oh, absolutely. It brings me such joy to talk to UChicago students because it was such a formative period of my life. This is where my journey in games started, in Patrick's class, thinking about games, daydreaming about games and play. And I don't know if any of you feel this way, but I wanted to major in everything, and I was full of existential dread, and I didn't know what to do with myself. So I studied physics, then I studied linguistics, then I switched into computer science my 4th year of UChicago. And I remember having a conversation with Sharon Salvador where I was like, hey, Sharon, do you think I could still graduate in 4 years if I switch majors now? And she looked at me and she's like, honey, technically yes, but I want you to know that your social life will be over. And I'm like, joke's on you, I didn't have a social life. So I graduated with a comp sci degree and a creative writing minor, which is a combination that is useful nowhere except for maybe games. My next step was in my confused back and forth aimless path was moving to Philadelphia for love with no plan. And I was like, don't know what to do with myself in classic UChicago fashion. Guess I'll go to grad school. So I applied for a bunch of different grad programs. And one of those was a computer graphics program, computer graphics and game technology program at the University of Pennsylvania. And I was like, I've always loved games. This makes sense. I went to grad school. I had a ball learning about computer graphics and the interdisciplinary arts. And I did well, and when I graduated, they happened to be hiring faculty, and they offered me a position as an instructor. So I taught at Penn for a while, and like a song in my heart, I developed this unshakable passion for procedural generation, which combines a lot of my favorite things: the art, the engineering, the design. Procedural systems, you're going to have to stop me because I could talk about that for a long time. But I decided that the missing piece of the curriculum that I had been, of the program that I'd been a part of was more arts and design focused classes that used technology as a tool set, because there were engineering classes and there were art classes. So I designed this interdisciplinary class and I was very happy teaching it. And completely happenstance, I got a scholarship to go to a game industry conference. And while I was there, I saw a talk on Magic the Gathering, whom I now owe my career. And it was a bunch of Magic the Gathering designers on stage. And I was like, I must speak to these Magic the Gathering designers. So after the talk, I was roaming around the floor and I couldn't find them. So I was like, I guess I'll settle for the guy who was interviewing them on stage, who was this Korean man named Min. And I like hunted him down in the dessert line. I was like, hey, I'm Rachel. You want to talk about magic? And he was like, yes, I do want to talk about magic. And we had an amazing conversation about games as social infrastructure and their value as an art form, but also their potential for building community. And one thing led to another. And before I knew it, I was being flown out to California to talk to my now game studio. So I now work for a small game studio called Bonfire Studios. My day-to-day work is mostly gameplay engineering, which is a little bit of engineering, a little bit of game design. And I still teach on the side for part of the year my class on creative coding. So if you ask me what my specialty is, it is the Venn diagrams that intersect with engineering in some way, but interdisciplinary arts. That is my long rambling answer.
Oh, that's amazing. Thank you so much, Rachel. And then Gamal, the same question, like, how did you get to where you're at? What did you study and how did you get to EA?
So my path was probably also not as straightforward as Rachel's. I was studying linguistics and computer science, and I think I switched to linguistics in my third year of college. I was actually close to completing the computer science major, and I had one class left, and I was like, I'm not really sure if I want to finish. I could just get a major in linguistics and then just go from there, but I took the second class and then just continued on with the major. And then I flew out to Washington to work at Microsoft, initially as a front-end engineer, just working on web UIs. And then slowly we hired in more actual, like, real qualified UI engineers, and I moved more to full stack / backend. So most of my experience is in like working with cloud technologies like Azure, and now I guess AWS. I did have a very, very close friend while I was attending the University of Chicago who was very interested in making language learning more accessible at like all levels of the spectrum. So not just for like beginners, like looking at flashcards, but exposing intermediate learners to real content rather than things like generated by like graded readers or whatever, which are not as always as close to like native content as you can get. So I left Microsoft to pursue that idea for about a year and a half with another friend that I met from UChicago. And along the way, I realized that I was moving much more away from like cloud to the field of like mobile. So just like programming for Android, programming for iOS. And then we decided that there very candidly wasn't an accessible business model that would let us continue on working on the project. So we decided to sunset operations. And then I was kind of like faced with this like fork in the road, like, do I want to go to grad school or do I want to go back into industry? And I decided that I would kind of like explore what meant anything to me, and games kept popping up. And I love games. So I was like, you know, I'm going to try to get into the gaming industry. So I failed at a couple of interviews because a lot of the positions were very like gameplay focused or required you to have some kind of like previous understanding of like how programming a game works. And I did have some experience in that, but not the experience I think that more senior levels were actually looking for. But along the way, I did find out that there is sort of an intersection between my experience as like a full stack developer and what game industries now need, because a lot of games are like live based, they have live services, they have things running in the cloud, and they actually need someone with that kind of experience. And so I was just applying for the wrong jobs. I found out that the tools developer is actually like the kind of job that I should be applying for. And so that's the way that I got hired at EA, currently where I work. And now I sort of dabble, my day-to-day, I guess you could say, is moving through Unity and programming tools that are integrated into Unity, programming tools that live outside of Unity as like standalone tools for art designers, QA engineers, and actually just game developers. And so it's kind of like touching on multiple areas of the game code. I'm not a game programmer or a game designer necessarily, but I am definitely a core part of the game development process. And that's kind of my intro.
Absolutely. Great, thank you so much for this. So a couple of things for you all who are in this session watching, especially for those of you who are undergraduate students or grad students, you should join the UChicago Game Design RSO. Meets every Monday at 7 p.m. They're gonna have a meeting today. And if you're interested in exploring games and trying to figure it out, do that with your peers. So that's just a little drop that I'll do for you all so that you can at least have a community of game developers. Now, I actually this is great because you all started to mention a bunch of different titles that I think, it would be really good if you could kind of describe the difference between a gameplay engineer versus a full stack developer versus QA engineer. Like there are a bunch of different things, a tool programmer. So could you both kind of take a high level step and differentiate these different titles, knowing that every studio is a little different. But could you kind of give a high level overview of these different roles and what you all specifically do and how that differs from these other roles? Anyone can take this.
Absolutely. So I would say one of the hardest things about getting into the games industry is finding what your place is within it. And it's because roles are a little ambiguous and very, very specific to the studio that you're at. So I'll give you an example. I have a friend at Bungie who is a level 2 senior game or tech or systems game designer, which means she works very specifically on quest systems and like a specific part of quest systems, like what are the milestones and how many NPCs interactions do each of these quest lines have and whatnot. And then I have a friend who works at a studio of 5 people and he does everything. So, and he is also a game designer. So it is highly, highly studio specific. The roles I have the most experience with are things that touch engineering because the base of my role is engineering. So what I do is gameplay engineering. This is engineering that very directly touches gameplay. So I might be responsible for, oh, hey, we need to be able to press the A button and have your character execute a spinning kick that lasts for 6 seconds and plays a VFX in the intro and the outro and does 30 points of damage in a cone in front of you and also applies a buff to everyone inside that cone that makes them blind. Things like that. I am responsible for scripting that behavior, creating tools that create that behavior, tuning that behavior, and talking with game designers to figure out how to make it feel good. So depending on your studio, a gameplay engineer might be more scripting and engineering focused of I am just building tools and then I will pass this to a designer that drives the tools, drives the car that I'm building. And at a smaller studio like me, those roles are a little more integrated. So I am both making things and then using my game design intuition to figure out, okay, given this pile of stuff and our current game design goals, figure out how to make this a good experience for players.
Awesome, thank you.
I can speak to the structure of my current studio. We have overarching, I guess, at a high level, 3 different departments. There's game design, there's QA, and then there's the tools team. So the tools team, if you can imagine, sits between QA and between the designers, and anything that could speed up the process of game development or testing is where I come in. So, for example, we have an event system that we put on a game where we have events that are scheduled on a time basis. So when you actually release the game, this event for Christmas needs to start on December 25th, whatever Christmas actually is, right? So if you have content that's locked behind the December 25th date, you may want to test that content like outside of the December 25th, because we're not going to release content to product like out testing. So a QA member may come to me and say, hey, Gamal, is there a way that we can test this content outside of prod? And then I have to go to the game designers, the server team, all the engineers and say, hey, what are the restrictions on releasing this content outside of prod? Is there a way that we can test this? And then I have to do all the engineering work to actually make that possible. Then I hand it over to QA and they test it and they get the green light. So things like that is like kind of like a pretty concrete separation of responsibilities that you might see as tools developed. I could actually totally go on and on about things, but that's subservient to the question.
Yeah, absolutely. Perfect. Thank you. And so, yeah, if you all have questions, keep throwing them in the chat. We have a question from William Shear, an amazing indie game designer who is living in Chicago here, created Manifold Garden. You should all play that game. Also, UChicago alum. So this is a question for Rachel, but I think it'll be a really interesting question for you to answer as well, Gamal. He'd love to hear about the technical details at Bonfire, if it's okay to share, of course. Does Bonfire Studios use a custom engine or Unity/Unreal? And is that experience very difficult from what you've learned in graduate school?
Ooh, great question. Two separate questions I'm hearing there. So question one, technical specs. My studio is using Unity. I would say most major studios, or even like a Blizzard, like did you know Hearthstone was built off Unity? Use a third-party engine like Unreal or Unity. Those are the two main ones. Unless you are building something crazy, like, I don't know, like a cool mirror reflection game, or you work for work on like World of Warcraft, which has a custom engine, you're probably going to be working off of like one of the major engines. Or if you work on something really small, like actually, I think even like Monument Valley was a Unity. But I work on Unity. It is difficult because tool making is a difficult technical craft that's difficult to prioritize in production. Each of the engines have their different quirks. And I program in C# every day. The custom engine experience is difficult. I would say if you are looking to develop your own games, I would recommend you definitely build off of a third party. So is this experience very different from what you learned in grad school? Absolutely. So I majored in computer science. I did quite a bit of programming for an undergrad and then in grad school. And I would say almost all of my experience was not totally useless, but not the skill set that I needed to be successful day to day. I think like so much of like the tricky stuff that I do for work is not like, oh, like go write A* algorithm or go write an A* algorithm. Like I like that's a minority of what I ever get to do is like write some algorithm. A lot of it is figuring out what we need to build, what the trade-offs of what we could build and why. Like, oh, should I go and spend like 2 weeks slapping something quick together to stand up the system so we can prototype it because we're like kind of sure that we might want that? Or should I plan to spend like 2 months on programming something like more robust and all of the things in between? So the programming that I do for work is very, very different from what I did in school. And I would say also there's a definite difference between computer science and software engineering, I would say, and at least the education that I got at first the University of Chicago and then at University of Pennsylvania, it was very computer science focused. Of all of my assignments and all of the focus in my classes is like, go make this work. And then your homework assignments will be graded on whether or not it works. And it can be one file and a gigantic pile of spaghetti. We don't care, you get an A. And when you go and work in an actual game studio, if you do that, you will be fucking fired. Well, not that you will be fucking fired. Actually, the reality is you will be fucking miserable because the person who will have to deal with that giant pile of spaghetti is you next week when you don't, or worse, in a month when you don't remember what any of that does. So I would say it is a very different game. What you are asked to do in school. I think like the most practical experience you can get is make a game. I know that the UChicago bias is like, let's study the theory and figure out exactly what skill sets we need to learn and whiteboard about everything. And like, don't get me wrong, that is who I am. I love that. But there are so many things that are the meat and potatoes of your work that you don't learn until you actually make a game. Like, how do I navigate the Unity UI? And what are the advantages and disadvantages of using like different texture formats? And what are the tools that I need to support those texture formats? All of the like interstitials of things that don't come up in a textbook or a formal class.
Mal, do you have anything you want to add?
I think that was very beautifully said. There's only one thing that I would like to add, but I think it's because of the quirk of the positions that I've applied to, and that some of the engineers who are moving into the tools/services space, their pedigree, I guess I would say, might be from software engineers of like the likes of like Google or Oracle. And so what happens is you have this weird phenomenon where they sort of import their interviewing tactics into the game industry. So if you've not sure anyone has interviewed at like a software company, but they tend to ask very computer science focused questions in an interview, even though your position is going to be working in Unity on like tools or whatever. So you may not actually have to like write algorithms on the job, but the actual job itself is sometimes gated on knowing like how A* might work, or just being able to just write up like a binary search or whatever in an interview. Like those skills should not be devalued at all, because I think the assumption is that when you're actually on the job, you kind of know these things in the back of your head as like part of your tool set. And so you may not use them every day, but you should know that, you know, like the trade-offs of like using the keyboard, using memory, like in routing should kind of have these things in the back of your head.
Absolutely, that's wonderful. And then I'll add, like, you know, if you all are considering grad school, every program is a little different and will teach you different things. And so, for instance, I went to Carnegie Mellon and I did the entertainment technology master's program, where it operates a bit different from other grad schools, where it has like set curriculum where you're taking a class and you're learning all these skills. Usually the people who are coming into this program have skills already, and basically they need to build a portfolio. And so they end up working with clients, which are other entities who need games or interactive experiences. So then it's this moment of all of that theory that I learned in, you know, my IT class, which was much more software engineering focused, is like, all right, here's your chance, 16 weeks, make it happen, and also talk to the person that needs this experience. So all of those algorithms that were like helpful in my class, you can now put it into practice. And you know, you have to learn to just throw things out and try and build something really quickly. But not all grad programs are like that. And also maybe you all don't necessarily need that specific type of program. So if you're curious about grad schools, you know, definitely come talk to us at the Weston Game Lab, and we can kind of talk to you about what would be a best fit for you. So we'll continue on with these amazing questions. And we have a question from Shi Cheng. The question is, and I'll kind of like broaden it out. Excuse me, actually, we're gonna go with Jessica's question, Jessica Guo. So for Rachel, have you used your creative writing minor in any way? And how has that helped you in the industry? And then also for Gamal, have you ever used your music, because apparently you compose, and your linguistics in personal projects? So we'll start there.
Okay, so let me start with my artsy UChicago answer first, in which I will say, yes, I have, because games are an art form, and art is what you make when you express the weird combination of perspectives that you have, and it brushes up against the rest of the world.
Yes, UChicago answer.
So absolutely yes, but more directly also yes, because games are, I think, very unique in that they're this bizarre combination of every different discipline. Like you need designers, you need programmers, you need writers, you need sound people, you need everybody. And also it's a whole live piece of software. It's all running in this strange play machine. But if you are in a studio that I think is well run, it's going to be a lot of interdisciplinary communication. And interdisciplinary communication means being able to translate whatever your skill set and set of priorities for the project are based on what your day-to-day craft is into and meet someone else in the middle when they're coming from design or art or something very different. So sometimes I talk to narrative designers, sometimes I talk to artists. And I think being able to think in terms of narrative design is very helpful for that part of my job. And also just being able to think about the story experience. I think like the UX design, what is the moment to moment experience for a player is the fundamentals of what building a good game experience is. And I think creative writing taught me a lot about that and about communication in general. If that's a little too abstract, I will also say that sometimes we literally just have meetings where our narrative designers are like, does anyone have any ideas about what this character should like do? And and I will be one of those people that's like, yes, I have a lot of opinions about what this character should do.
For me, I have not used my linguistics background, I think at all in my current position at EA. Music, also not so much, but as Rachel was saying, there's a lot of interdisciplinary communication that happens in your day-to-day. So I may be in meetings with the localization team, and we need to be able to understand how to go from whatever my position is to whatever the local team needs to happen. And so being able to understand what terms are being used by the local team is something that you can definitely acquire on the job. Not to say that someone who doesn't have like an idea of what localization like look like can't acquire those skills on the job, but it definitely helps when you're translating terms from the engineering world into something that is like non-technical. And I think the experience I've had allows me to do that a little bit better. But I think most of my experience on the job is definitely engineering, more engineering focused, definitely. But it's important.
All right, now the question for Shih-Ching. So thank you for being super patient. All right, so the question, you two are engineers, but there are a bunch of students who aren't engineers here hanging out in the chat. So how do students with no programming backgrounds find their way into the game industry? Is it possible?
Oh,
and how do?
It's absolutely possible. As I was just saying, like games are a big katamari of every different discipline. So there's definitely a corner for you. I think the key ingredient is faith, pure blind faith. I think that for many different industries, especially when you have very little direct experience in an industry, as you would as an undergrad or someone who's not been in the professional sphere yet, it's easy to just kind of follow the pipeline of what everyone else is doing. So the engineering equivalent is like, oh, I'm an engineer, so I should get a job at Amazon. And the way to do that is to read Cracking the Code interview and then doing a bunch of interviews, and then I get a job. The game industry does not work like that. There are a couple of big studios like Blizzard and Riot and Bungie maybe, or Microsoft Game Studios, or that do have that strict pipeline recruiters or whatnot, but like I can't tell you how many people I know who were like, I just really loved Naughty Dog games. And then I cold emailed somebody who worked at Naughty Dog and they were like, oh, you seem like an enterprising young kid. Like, why don't I forward you to someone else who can help you out? And do you have a portfolio? So I would say the pure blind faith part of it is do not be dissuaded by the fact that there is not a set pipeline or a strict set of steps that will get you into the game industry necessarily. But I would say that whatever your skill set is, figure out how you can apply this to make games. The best way to do that is to actually make games and see your skills in action, to have proof that you can contribute to a game by having a portfolio of games that you've made. And when I say games, don't be intimidated. It can be like a 2-person, 2-week project that you did one summer that is playable somewhere. But do that, make a portfolio, and then get connected with a community of other people that make games. Because I mean, who cares about these fancy companies like Riot and Blizzard or whatnot? A lot of my favorite games were made by like 1 or 2 people in a garage somewhere. You don't need to be a part of one of these companies to make games. Go do that. But if really, really you want to work for a specific studio, email those people. Be friends with people who are adjacent to those studios, not because you need to like put on your black bowler hat and like network and whatnot, but just make friends with people who have interesting perspectives and connections in the game industry. And sooner or later, you will run into a good opportunity. Every one of my interesting moves in the game industry, be it my main job or like all of my kind of like side hustle opportunities, have all been from talking to people. I'm sorry, I've been rambling a lot. My last thought is, don't be afraid to be a special case. Everyone in the game industry is a special case. There is no cookie cutter game developer.
Yeah, so the thing that sparked any recruiters, I think, interest in my profile as an engineer was this bullet point I had in my resume about the game that I made in senior year. So like just having something to show, it shows that, you know, you care about games, that you are a gamer yourself, maybe, or that you actually have some like passion working with games as like a concept. So many of my interviews, some of the time actually focused on the game development experience I had with the game itself that I was building, not necessarily my experience at Microsoft or whatever. So they were just like, yeah, cool, you were at Microsoft, we don't really care. Let's talk about this like game that you built with your other friend. So I would say getting into the game industry is like, do it now because you can. Like, there's nothing stopping you from making a game right now. Like, as long as you have an idea, you can just like go and do it. So just go and do it, and something will come your way, hopefully.
So this is another great opportunity to plug the UChicago Game Design RSO, where, you know, if you're trying to get into the game industry and you need to make things, build up your portfolio, make something happen, because that's the way to get in to the industry, have something to show. And so I'm going to jump in and ask a question, you two as engineers. What does a portfolio look like for an engineer? How does that look different for maybe someone who is, let's say, a non-technical game designer versus like an artist? What does an engineering portfolio look like?
Excellent question. I would say representing your skills and having the skills that you need to do your job are orthogonal things, kind of like how getting into college and being good at being a student in college are different things. I would say the representing that you can make games can take many different forms, but I would say either a lot of depth or a lot of breadth in projects, preferably a minimum, or the depth is much more important than the breadth. So I think it is totally fine for you to live in a closet and write a renderer over a summer and write a beautiful path tracer and have a bunch of test renders. If you are interested in the visual aspects of coding, like that can be a portfolio. If you're interested in networking and building multiplayer games, then maybe your portfolio will be like, here is a ASCII Pong game that is like has the most beautiful network model that you've ever seen. If you are interested in gameplay, then maybe it's like some gray box like cubes fighting each other, or an item system for a with a complicated inventory. It can take many different forms. Don't be afraid to just showcase the things that you are interested in. Or if you're a designer, it's fine if you submit a bunch of games that aren't like completely arted, but that show your design sensibilities. Polish is always helpful. It's always going to be more impressive if you work with a team of 5 and you Power Rangers Voltron together to create something that looks and plays well. But as long as you are able to showcase, like, here is what I did, and I can speak very specifically about what features and work I contributed to this project, it counts. There is no formula for being a good game or a good game development applicant.
Nothing really bad, actually. I think that's like the perfect answer. Just showcase what you care about. I think format, if we're talking about concretely how to make your portfolio accessible to other people so that they can see it. As an engineer, GitHub is one way to do that because your code is accessible. I would probably recommend making sure that it's code that people can view is code that you want them to see. So having several like little kind of things that maybe aren't relevant to what your current aspirations are, or these like created like these auto like generated like applications or whatever that don't have any content in them. Like maybe those are not something that you want to be public. In my case, I had a YouTube video of the games that I programmed. So I just threw up, I made a trailer of the game that I was working on and threw up a link on YouTube, and actually linked that in my resume. So that was like part of my portfolio. I don't know that there's like a set format, but any way that you can make it accessible is probably good. Just make it easy for people to see.
For sure.
Yeah.
So I think that's a really excellent point, Jamal, to build off of that. Like everything is a game, including getting a recruiter to take you seriously. So it's, like click optimization of the better the tool, the least number of clicks to do things. Like if you're trying to show a recruiter your game, don't be like, oh yeah, just go to this website and download this executable and make sure that no. Make a WebGL build of your game so that you just open your website and it's in your face, or have a YouTube. If you can't do that, then make a YouTube video so that somebody can see gameplay as directly as possible. I know people who like carry around an iPad at conferences so they can like show people their game directly.
Exactly. Love that. GIFs are also your friends, also pronounced as GIFs, but like, who are you? But like GIFs are your friends, right? And so show that gameplay loop on your portfolio. Thank you so much for that question. All right, for answering that question. All right, we have a question from Shishu. All right, I have a social science background and I've taught myself C#. Do you have any suggestions for improving my development skills, specifically for indie game development? So we have a person who has some coding experience, but they want to improve that, get better. How would this person do this?
Oh, well, you're sitting in exactly the right spot. You've got incredible skills already. I would say just make games. If at all possible, keep working on the same game and make it a long project. Because when you work on games in the real world, a thing that you think is going to take 2 weeks is going to take you 6 months. And a thing that you think is going to take you 6 months is going to take you 3 years. And so a lot of the skill of being a good developer is not just, as I was mentioning before, like the interstitials of sewing together a lot of like complex interdisciplinary topics, but also iteration. A lot of games get stuck in that ooey gooey middle of development where you have an idea and 3 years later you have a finished product, but in the middle it's this kind of like winding iterative path of looking for the fun in your game, which is weirdly the trickiest part, figuring out how to make your game fun. Because you might have all of the elements, like you might have characters that move and gameplay mechanics and whatnot, but something just doesn't feel good. So a lot of it is just working and reworking. So I'll give you an example. On my game, I think we're on version 3 of or 4 of our 3 of our camera and control system. I spent like 3 or 4 months building this like really elaborate camera script for navigating around the world, and then I threw it away. And did that hurt? Absolutely, yes it did. But was it valuable? Yes, because we needed to know how to make our camera feel good in our game, and so that was like valuable research. It's one of the 99 ways not to build a light bulb. And if you are a good developer, you're going to be able to construct your prototypes, because everything is a prototype until you ship, in a meaningful and reusable way. So I did not do this. So I was only able to compost like very limited parts of the camera system that I originally wrote. but being a developer, I guess like the milestone number 1 is make it work in any way that you can. Milestone 2 is have some confidence and vision for what the development process will look like so that you can be a little smart about how you try things. About being like, well, I'm building an inventory system now, and I really only expect to be able to pick up items but never drop items, but I might want to be able to drop items someday, so I'm not going to like completely shoot myself in the foot by making it super hard to drop items someday.
Yeah, V1 is important, and just because it isn't perfect doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. So you should just kind of like scope an MVP, which is shorthand for minimum viable product, like if you can. I guess this is more of like my software engineering background talking, but there are things that you can do with your current tool set. So I'll give you a for instance, like when I was working on the game with my other friend at UChicago, we didn't actually know how multiplayer networks works at all. So we didn't seek to write one ourselves. We looked to do something like off the shelf. There are libraries that will give you multiplayer capabilities. One of them is like Photon, which I don't think is actually called Photon anymore because Unity might have actually bought them. But when we were working on it, it was definitely called Photon. And we used our skills as engineers because, you know, UChicago wants to have a pretty solid foundation in computer science. So we were good at writing algorithms, but we weren't good at knowing how to do things quickly within the Unity engine. So we spent more time figuring out how to work on Unity than we did on re-implementing the wheel for every feature we wanted to write. So like scoping what you want to do, I think lets you become a better engineer because it lets you figure out what you need to do, what you need to know, and how long something is going to take. So I think Jazz, you have a second question, which I think is kind of like directly relevant to this question.
Yeah, go ahead and say Jazz's question out loud.
So it's as engineers, how do you estimate the time tasks take? An underrated skill, super underrated actually. Is this largely left to managers or producers to estimate? Rachel, you can correct me on this or add to this, but I think it largely depends on the structure of your studio and the timeline management system that they have. Some companies use something called sprints. Some studios use something called Kanban, which is a little bit different. Kanban is more kind of like a sort of like waterfall process where you don't have separate, like distinct dates for deliverables. So it allows you to have a little bit more of a flexibility with the things you're implementing. And so it's kind of left up to the engineer to communicate deadlines, really, I think. Sprints are a little bit different, where I work, you have a producer who allocates a fixed set of things we call points to deliverables. So maybe this is like a really small story. Maybe this is like a big story. Maybe this is like a super story. Like every, like I guess quarter, we have like maybe 160 points, and we have a set of deliverables, things we already know we want to do. And we say, hey, how many of these things can we fit into these 3 months? And then we divide the 3 months based on like 2 or 3 weeks. And every sprint, we just pull in things from that backlog, and then we work on those things. If things slip, that's okay. That just needs to be communicated to like everyone else in the studio, because it's not just you programming something, like you're working on a team. So art may need to know, QA may need to know, and then expectations are adjusted accordingly. How do you estimate the time something takes? I generally like to use the rule of 1.5x, which is if you think it takes this amount of time, 1.5 exit or 2 exit. It's really, it depends on like how many unknowns there are. Like if you have something that you have an area that you're pretty familiar with, like if I don't know anything about networking code, I might like double that time because I know that I'm going to have to spend time researching and investigating, maybe talking to people who are experts in that domain to implement the things that I need to do. If there's something that I know only depends on me and I don't have to factor in talking to other departments to like get what I need to get done, then maybe the time might be a little bit less. So I think it's a combination of self-experience, knowing how the studio works, knowing who's available and when they're available, because you can't always talk to people when you want to talk to them, and giving a best guess. Yeah.
I would say it really comes with experience. I work with super veteran game developers that have been making games for like 25 years and they're still bad at estimation. It's just a hard thing to do because unless you're like, unless your game is a really known quantity, which is rarely the case, unless we set out and we're like, we're just going to make Bejeweled, but with fish. It's really difficult to say how long anything is going to take. I think the smaller the task, the more certainty you can have about something. But I would say when you are guesstimating how long something will take when you're working with a team, keep in mind a couple of different things. One, factor in time at the beginning to figure out what you are making. I cannot stress how important this thing is. But I can't tell you how many times I've had one conversation with like our game director and he's like, oh yeah, we just need this ability. I'm like, okay, I can go make this ability. And then I come back tomorrow after I've already invested a bunch of research and time. And he's like, oh yeah, so that thing that I said, like, forget that. We actually need something totally different. I'm like, oh, fun. Need to start from the drawing board. So I would say one of the most important things to do is to really figure out what you are trying to accomplish. And like user research, it's like, don't ask people for what they want, figure out what they need. When you're talking to designers or other users, whoever your customer is, whether it's game designers or artists or other engineers, talk to them and figure out like one level more abstract than what you're asking for. Like, why are we building this tool? That will save you some time. And that is okay if you spend, even as an engineer, like days, a week, not coding just because you are in meetings and talking to people and figuring out what you need to build. That's step one. Step two, actually build the thing, which, you know, takes time, lots more conversations possibly. And step three, if you are integrating your feature into a big complicated project, which almost every game is, you will have fallout of maintenance and bug reports and blah, 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 and iteration for days afterwards. So when I factor in how long is something going to take, if I think that if I became a robot and just sat in a closet, it would take me like 2 days of work, that's probably like a week and a half long task, at least, because of all of the talking before and after and the iteration afterwards. One other thing I will say, I had this like crazy idea when I graduated from UChicago, probably because UChicago like ruined me, that an 8-hour workday means I do 8 hours of work. No, I have never done 8 pure hours of work, I swear. When it comes to like actually coding, if I do a total of like 4 or 5 hours of really solid coding work, that's an amazing day. Because there's also meetings, there's also you're a human that has other things to do and has bodily needs and you know, one-on-ones with your coworkers where you're just chatting. So when you also do that calculus, don't think like, oh, I have 8 hours of coding work today, because that is never the case.
Exactly. Oh my gosh, such good advice. And I'll even just throw out from like an educational game design standpoint of like, we used sprints for our project management. And I would just continue to plus one what Gamal said of like adding extra time, right? I loved the 1.5, but I was always like, okay, it's 2 or 2.5 because I'm working with people, some people who understood games really well, but a lot of people who, because we're making educational games, are like, I don't even know what this game reference you're even making. And I'm just like, oh no. And just like in Rachel's example, we would have like PIs who would come in and be like, oh, okay, this thing that we actually need something else. We need it to be more accessible. And I'm like, I totally agree with that. Now we need to have subtitles and a cutscene. It's like, oh, snap, freak out. And then we have to like, you know, expand the thing. So absolutely you got to figure out how to manage your time. And it only happens over practice and time. All right, we have another question from Jazz. Oh, and again, to just kind of describe what a sprint is, just to make sure we all understand it. But like Gamal was saying, a sprint is a type of management process. It falls under agile development. So this idea that you're taking features and you're breaking them down into the things and the steps that you need, and you're assigning usually a small chunk of time for everyone to kind of work on it. The average time is usually about 2 weeks. And so people are working on a feature for like 2 weeks. So for instance, if you need a character controller, because the character on screen has to move and has to take controller input. Now the character needs to be able to walk, maybe jump, pick up things, right? All of those things are under what the character can do and how you can control that character. And maybe if you have the list of all the things that the character needs, and you can say, hey, it's a 2D simple platformer game, simple air quotes. As a programmer, I can finish all that in 2 weeks, because maybe you've programmed 2D character controllers before and you know exactly what you need to do until you don't, right? So that's what a sprint is. It's just a kind of short period of time where you set up a bunch of features that you're going to work on. And then at the end of those 2 weeks, you check in and make sure that you've actually completed those tasks. And if they don't work, you'll take those tasks and put them into the next sprint. Okay, another question from Jazz. You both seem to have experience producing projects without peers to turn to. Do you have recommendations on how to leverage insights from peers with more experience? How do you learn from them? From people that might be shy, like new people at internships, right? So.
Yes.
Oh,
Oh.
sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
That is an excellent question. The managing up kind of experience, or I don't like that because someone might not be your manager, but I would say something that is helpful to me is it's kind of like that myth of Hercules where some dude has his cart and his donkey overturned on the road, and he calls out for Hercules before he's even put his shoulders to the cart. And Hercules comes over and he's like, bitch, you better try first before you ask me for help. Like, I will help you, but like, give it a go. Especially when it comes to game development, which is, I feel like, an extremely learn by doing craft. Try something first. Like, if you are trying to make a camera system and you are overwhelmed with anxiety because you don't know how to make a camera system and you know that there's a camera system expert nearby, like, by all means, ask them for help. But it's often a lot easier to structure your questions and the things that you're asking for help if you have tried first. So make something shitty, do a terrible first draft, and then go over with your macaroni art to the expert and be like, I made this thing. I've noticed that it has many problems. Can you help me fix the problems? And your mentor will probably be able to help you fix the problems, but also take a step back and discuss the problem at a higher level of like, oh, I would have approached this a little differently. But because you have a little bit of domain experience from trying to do the thing the first time, your questions and your conversation with them will be a lot more contextualized. So I would say number one thing is like, try a little bit first, because you don't know what you don't know. And so try to do some R&D about what you don't know first by getting your hands dirty.
I'll touch on the newbie, or the feeling of a newbie aspect, which I think I felt because I was coming from like a kind of separate domain, like computer, like web engineering is like building websites and whatnot. It's kind of different from the tools domain. I actually found out that it's really not that different because of the position I had previously, which actually was a tools engineer, but just not called that because titles are fun to. I realized that kind of nobody really knows what they're doing, or I mean, everyone knows that they came from a place where you currently are, and there's no set one way to do anything. Like, there isn't this holy grail that you can look to on the internet that everyone but you has access to, where they just look up the answers and they do everything in a very, very specific way. Everything is sort of like a creative process. So if you have questions, and this may differ based on the company culture, but in my case, I could go to someone and say, hey, after I've done all of the things that Rachel said to do, like, my own investigation, hey, I don't understand this. Here are my issues. Can you help me? Like, that is a perfectly okay thing to do. You don't have to feel like you're an expert at everything before you go and ask questions. Just like try something to get it out so that you actually, at the very least, have access to some of the domain specific language so you can communicate with that person. So I think getting the language is the hard part or the barrier. And then once you have that, then I think it's totally okay to just ask pretty much anyone for help.
Can I want to push that question even further, like to get the domain knowledge, which I think is actually a great thing, because then you can know how to hold a conversation with a person. But if you don't know something, how do you go about obtaining the knowledge that you don't know? What are some of those steps there? I feel like this is a very philosophical question. So please, the core is about to come through.
Yes, this is the core skill for being a game developer, I think, is how do you learn something that you don't know, especially when you're like, I really don't know what I don't know. I think like the UChicago bias is to be like, let me like get some theory down. I'm gonna like do a tutorial about something abstract, and after I've done 10 tutorials and curriculized it, done this perfect curriculum, I will understand something. No, every problem is super custom, as Jamal put so eloquently, and I feel like I really am an advocate for project-based learning in game development. Try to do something, and then as soon as you get stuck, Google it. Like, oh no, render target is error, render target is missing. Try Googling that error. Like, what if the render target is missing? Like, I am a big advocate of the 15-minute rule of, if I am stuck on something and I try my absolute best, like pretend there is no one else in the world that you can ask. What would you do? Try your best for 15 minutes. And if you are still stuck, or maybe like bump that number if it's like a really tricky question, then ask for help. Call one of your more senior peers and be like, I am truly stumped. Can you give me any pointers about how to do this? But some of the things you might investigate. These all sound, I feel like once I learned these things after being a professional software developer for fucking 5 years, I was like, these all seem like really obvious in hindsight, but they were not things that occurred to me to do when I was a noob, which is fine because everything is like that, right? As soon as you know the answer, you look back and hindsight is 2020. So don't feel stupid if it takes you a while. But one, like figuring out like what the right amount of educated guesses to try are before asking for help for like 15 minutes. Some of those educated guesses might be like, oh, I need to find something in the code base. Let me like take 5 guesses at what this thing might be named and just search through the code base and see what files pop up. Do they have anything in common? Like, is there a Tower Builder 1, Tower Builder 2, Tower Builder editor? Like, oh, looks like there's a lot of editor code. Or if there's an error, try Googling that error. If it is something more like kind of process or game design based, like try searching through your company's whatever their equivalent of Google Drive is. Just by like trying to scratch the surface on like a little bit of investigative journalism style like research, you can actually get pretty far.
That is almost always possible, because as a newbie, usually they're not giving you something that is like a completely new domain. Like you might be adding to like a specific component of the system that already kind of exists. So searching through the code base 100% plus one. I've done that many times. And then Google is your friend. Oftentimes I don't even know what questions I want to ask. So if I Google something like stupid, like literally something like an error or whatever, that will sometimes lead me to a discussion about the things that I care about. And sometimes like on Stack Overflow or the Unity forums, or sometimes even Reddit, someone will give you a new vocabulary word that is in the domain you care about. So I was like recently working on React, which is just like a framework for building applications. And I was just like, I need to save like this text somewhere else. And I didn't have the vocabulary to search for the actual question that I wanted to ask. So I was Googling like random things, and then that gave me the vocabulary to like just ask the question I needed to ask. And then when I typed that into Google, I got my answer. But until then, I couldn't ask the question I wanted to ask. So yeah, searching is your friend.
I love that. I love that. That's so well put. Giving you the vocabulary to Google better. I gotta say, I have put some stupid ass Google search questions into my browser before. Like sometimes I'm not gonna lie, like a couple years ago, I would search for things like how do I make things look like fire in Unity? Like, and you know what? That might be a good starting point because it might pull up a tutorial or two that I'd like look through and I'm like, oh, okay, I should like look into this shader graph thing, and then I can look up a shader graph tutorial. Don't be afraid to start to start like really broad and narrow things in.
Absolutely. I honestly, my first language that I knew was Java, and I knew no C#. And my introduction to Unity and C# was quite literally me trying to type Java code into C# and getting a bunch of errors and then fixing those errors. And that's how I learned C#. Right? It was like, that is just all trial. I took no C# classes, no Unity classes, but I now know Unity really well because I'm like, well, I know how to do this in Java. Is it going to work? Absolutely not. That's not how you initiate an array. And like I part of me was feeling like if Unity could talk, Unity would be like, girl, what are you doing here? But it totally worked, right? And so again, like game development, game design is all trial and error. I really love the language of it's a craft, right? If we talk about theory and practice, we kind of lose the conversation around craft of like, what does it mean to just spend time with this object and try and like finesse your skill around building an object, right? That takes time, energy, effort. Some things you'll know, some things you won't know, but you'll be able to start feeling it out. And that's really important. Oh no, I hope you all can't hear my Discord going off. Like I thought I was in streamer mode, but maybe I'm not. Okay, so we have about 10-ish, 15-ish minutes left before we transition to, are there any more questions in the chat? Because I have a bunch of other questions I could ask, but I wanna give space. I wanna provide time for people who are not me. Oh, because I can also ask Jazz's question. You take the time, ask the questions in the chat. I'm gonna go ahead and ask Jazz's question, and then I have questions about like studio culture and like, because you've been to a bunch of different studios, like, what do you look for in a studio, but let me ask this question. Okay. Okay, if others don't have a question, okay. Jazz says, I think the Mad Center solved this in some sense, but do you have recommendations for people that might be struggling to keep working on their project? That's an excellent question. Could be from feeling isolated, not knowing a community, etc. So what would you recommend for people who are struggling to just continue to work on their project, knowing that you all might be hacking away at a project for like a year, 2 years, 4 years, right? How do you stay focused?
I love this question. Okay, so I have recontextualized my life at the ripe old age of 29 as life is one long, rambling rabbit chase after your motivation. I think that motivation is the magic elixir key substance kryptonite of what keeps you going through anything. And I think that only you can know what keeps you motivated. Is it working with other people? Is it more specifically impressing other people and having like or is it just getting to talk to people day to day? Is it specifically coding? Is it specifically like creating visuals? Only you can know like what those things are. For me, personally, it's definitely a lot about talking to people about my ideas. I don't even have to have anything to show for myself at the end of the day. But if I'm like, I got to articulate my project to somebody and hear it articulated back, that fills my well. So I think you need to figure out what it is that that you need. I think that for a lot of people, some amount of socialization and community support are very important. For some people, the online and just like being a part of a Discord or two is really helpful. I know like for me, when I'm working on like a personal project where I'm beholden to no one, like it's very easy for me to goof off. So I'll do something like, oh, I'm going to share some gifts, Ash, to a Discord and show a bunch of strangers and get some comments and feedback, and that feedback will give me ideas, and it like makes my heart glad to see that other people are thinking about something that I've made, and that will push me to keep going. But I think another thing that is a hot topic in the games industry and should be a hot topic everywhere is burnout. My personal formula for burnout is when effort exceeds motivation. So I think that you can be very motivated and you can still work too hard and get burnt out. And I think like it's kind of important to identify that. So for burnout, I kind of think of motivation as money in the bank. If I know that I need to do something, I'm thinking about, is there a way that I can work less hard, or is there a way that I can be more motivated? And do not get burnt out, because I think like when you get to a certain amount of like emotional redlining, it takes you more time to recover than it would be to just like slow down and take like longer weekends or work shorter hours. I hope that helps, but it is a very personal thing.
That's hard. Personally, the way I stay motivated is I find that I'm very responsive to having someone else keep me accountable for what I'm doing. So oftentimes, actually almost all the time, all of my projects have been with at least one other person, because if I am by myself, I will probably goof off, or I'll probably go off on a tangent where I'm like an engineer running around like with my head cut off like a chicken, sort of implementing things that nobody else really cares about. Like I'll go and I'll write some like fancy code that doesn't actually produce anything that anyone can see. And it's because I think that's just like what I'm sometimes comfortable doing. Like it is sometimes hard to push yourself to complete a finished thing that other people can see. At least for me, it's easier in my head, at least, to work on like specific blocks of tasks, I guess, that are like very, very well defined. So the way I keep myself motivated if I'm working by myself is, instead of writing, hey, I want to, like, I guess like when I was just working on something that I can't tell you guys about because it is a company thing. There was a task that was like pretty nebulous that came from a producer, and the way that I very, very quickly got started on that task is by opening up a notepad and writing down like details, or like how this thing could be done very, very concretely. So I wasn't stopped by the idea that, oh, this is just like a nebulous task that like I can't finish, or this is going to take like X amount of days. Like really like break down the thing into very, very concrete things that you can do today, like right now. So there's no reason for you to put it off in the future. Like if it's like a 5-minute task or whatever, like even if you need to go that small, like this thing is going to take me 5 minutes to do. Like if that's what gets you like going, then that's how small the task should be. So yeah, I think everything motivation wise is different for everyone, but for me, if something seems unachievable, then sometimes I kind of like try to shy away from it. So I try to make unachievable as achievable as possible, and that's a pretty easy thing to do.
Totally. Sometimes when I'm like having a really bad brain day, my like to-do list will be like open email to this person. And then maybe I'll be able to come back later and be like, type the first sentence of this email. One other thing that I think really helps me, I like sports. So, and I think it's really hard to kind of be self-aware because we're not trained to think in this way of like how to protect our emotional and mental resources. And game development is very mentally and emotionally taxing work. I try to analogize it to sports of like, if I'm working on a really hard technical problem, I think of it as like, this is like going on an all-day hike. I'm going to be nice to myself before, and I'm going to be nice to myself after, by making sure that I pick fun, easy, different problems, in the same way that like I try and get a lot of sleep and like maybe have a Netflix and jammies day after my like big hike, and try and do that for yourself.
Thank you. That's a really great analogy, actually. All right, we have a question from Crystal. Oh, she teaches in the space. So this is a question for Rachel. Can you elaborate more about community and games? Would be interested in hearing more about the human/social aspects of games and play.
Ooh, absolutely. So I think that games are all about behavioral economics. And I'm excited to hear that you're an educator also, Crystal, because that's one of the things that I think gets a lot of crossplay in my mind between my two different jobs of being an educator and a game designer. I think that like being a teacher is about designing a good classroom experience between your students. And a lot of the problems that are most interesting to me in games are how can we like tweak a little bit of the rules of our fictional universe and create better behavior interactions between players. And when I interact with really experienced game designers, what the skills that I think they have are greater empathy and greater foresight about how a rules change will affect behavior. And I think that it's really interesting sometimes the way that a little bit of framing can totally change the way something is perceived. I'll tell one of my head game designers' favorite stories. The founder of my studio, Rob Pardo, was the uh, creative director at Blizzard for many years. He was like a head designer on World of Warcraft. And World of Warcraft had the unprecedented problem of having players be too interested in their game. So the WoW team was like, how can we help players that are addicted to our game play less? So Rob goes off by himself and he's like, all right, I'm going to think about this. And he comes back and he's like, okay, I've got it. So how about if after the first 2 hours of your WoW play, we give players a experience debuff so they only earn half as much XP to discourage people. And everyone hated this idea. People hated it. They were like, this is punishing players. This is bullshit. People are going to be so mad. And Rob was like, okay. So he leaves. He comes back and he's like, I got it. What if we gave people a bonus that doubles your XP for the first 2 hours that you play? And everyone's like, brilliant. I love it. That's great. And then the bonus wears off and you leave. And this is exactly the same thing. But that bit of framing completely changed the way that people felt about the new feature and the way that they talked about it. And I think about that a lot when I interact with games. Another interesting example is Apex Legends. If any of you played that game, has a really extensive ping system so that it's easy to communicate without using voice, which has made it a more friendly and less toxic community for people that often don't feel comfortable getting on voice comms, such as female players who like have received a lot of toxicity in games like PUBG or League of Legends. So it's a broad question that you asked, but I think that games are critical in our time because they're a way of connecting people. I can't tell you how many people I know play PUBG just to keep in contact with people that they know. And it's just an excuse to hang out. And if there's like an awkward lull in the conversation, you can like chuck a grenade to the next house or whatnot. And then, you have like something to do. But I think that games are a critical piece of social infrastructure for that reason. They're connecting people in a time, especially when not everyone feels safe leaving their house or going into public spaces, and giving you excuses to know people that you wouldn't, that sometimes you wouldn't otherwise know at all or be able to stay connected with at all. So when I talk about social infrastructure, I'm talking about like how do the current slate of games that are available contribute to building healthy, happy communities? What are the game design decisions that contribute to pro-social behavior or toxic behavior? And I think it's really fun and really important to ask like what those relationships are.
Thank you. Guys, do we have time for one more question? I'm gonna ask the culture question.
Yes, please do.
Okay. So this will be the last question for the night before we transition into one-on-ones. But it's a question about culture. Like we all know the game industry, hit or miss when it comes to culture. It's great, produces great things, produces terrible things. And so, I work with a lot of undergraduates who are interested in going in the game industry, and they're excited because they love these games, but then they're also like, but, I'm afraid of like working in this, like studio, like what would happen, X, Y, and Z. So I would love to hear like your experiences of working in either your current studios or other studios. What do you look for when you are in the interview process, and how do you judge a really good culture, and when do you determine that a culture is really bad? Gamal, do you want to start?
I can start. There are two questions that I ask or have asked in my interviews. The first question is, do you guys have crunch? And I ask that question because I want to know when a game is close to release, how much people will be working an hour or days or weeks before. And for those of you who aren't familiar, or from what I understand, what happens at some game companies is that when crunch time happens or you're getting close to release, people are working longer hours. And what I found is that when I asked about crunch, one of my interviewers at a company that will not be named disclosed to me that one of their games was canceled because of the way people were treated during crunch time. So a lot of people just kind of like got up and left and said they didn't want to deal with the hassle of crunch time because producers were just not respecting their personal time and asking them to work considerably longer hours, and there was no compensation for any of it. Not that compensation is like top of mind for people, but like it turned what you are passionate about and what you love to work on into a chore. And that's not why a lot of people are in the game industry, as far as I know. It's not why I'm here. I love to work on what I work on. So to turn that into a chore makes me not work on it. So I can see why that would happen to other people. I ask this other question sort of indirectly, and I'm not a super big fan of, I'm not like, it's not really something I look for, but at a previous job that I had sort of an encounter with one of my, how do I explain this succinctly? I'll be very, very candid. It was very, very bro-y. And some of the women were just not treated like correctly. Like in some meetings, like they were just like totally passed over, even though there were like key stakeholders in like a feature we were producing. So because of some of those experiences, I kind of shadily ask like what the makeup of the team is, just so that I know that the company that I'm going into is not like sidelining employees for like random reasons, either because of sexism or like racism or like whatever. And I think I sit pretty like in the middle. I would consider myself pretty like privileged or whatever, but it really, really impacts like how I feel about a team and the work we actually get done if people are not respecting others like credentials or like their potential to contribute to a thing. It's just, it's total noise and nonsense when not everyone can be their best selves like at work. So I try to filter out those companies because I know that they do exist. I am fortunate to work at a company that does respect, to my experience, does respect everyone on the teams. So yeah, I filter for things, or I try to filter. That's been my experience. How about you, Rachel?
I'm a woman of color. I'm a minority in the game industry. It feels bad to be a minority, and oftentimes in many places. I think like what good culture is a very personal question, similar to like what motivates you, but I can make some generalizations. I think like in order to do your best and most creative work, you need to feel comfortable communicating with your coworkers and collaborators and feel like you are heard, and you need to feel safe first and foremost. Again, what those are for you are going to be very specific. For me, feeling safe and heard, some things that I look for when I talk to people are microaggressions. If you're not familiar with the term microaggressions, it's like small behaviors that make people feel unwelcome. So for example, a very common one is it is statistically proven to be more likely for men to interrupt women than it is for women to interrupt men. So one thing that I pay close attention to when I'm in interviews or talking to a new studio is like, how often do people interrupt me? How often do people interrupt each other? Because if I'm in a situation where people are interrupting each other all the time in meetings, it makes me uncomfortable and harder for me to do my best work. The diversity and inclusion piece is very important for me because working in a diverse community of game developers is one of my primary motivations for being in the games industry. So I am not shady or shy about asking about it at all. I'll be like, hi, how diverse is your team? What are the demographics? Why don't you have more women? And I think if people do not have a good answer for you, or that is a bad sign. People are, for things that are known problems, people, it is not enough to be like, oh, I don't know, like that seems important. I want to hear like specific, concrete things that people are doing. For example, if I'm like, I've noticed that I will be the only or one of 2 women on this team. Like, what will you do to support me? Like, be upfront about it. Like, don't be shy. You're not going to offend anyone. Like, if you are in the position of being a minority on your team, like it is your company, your organization's responsibility to support you. That's the inclusion piece of the diversity and inclusion. So on the culture piece, I would say it's know what you want or what you need. And that's not an easy thing to always do, especially if you have very little professional experience. Another thing you can do is just talk to a bunch of people that would be on your team and be like, hey, tell me what you think the culture of your studio is like. What do you like about the culture? What do you not like about the culture and why? Ask those questions up front so you're not surprised by them 3 months in.
Thank you so much for answering this question. And that concludes our panel. If we get a round of applause, like, like you can't unmute yourself, but like, thank you to Rachel and Gamal for giving us their expertise for this hour and a half. We're going to now transition over, or we're going to take a break, right? Like we're going to take a break before, Gamal and Rachel do their one-on-ones.